people to the Better Living Centre, and it's a building that we own. And so therefore we could expand it yesterday and expand it again today, as we've done without having to phone anybody or without having to really make a lot of arrangements. I'm not trying to oversimplify the task of expanding these things, because Mark Aston and the people from Fred Victor who are running the Better Living Centre are doing a very complicated job in an exemplary fashion, as has been mentioned. But I will just say to you, in terms of that part of the city, the Fort York Armories is located a couple of blocks away from the Better Living Centre, so that is why I've mentioned today that we're going to be pursuing the matter of the Moss Park Armories, where if we need the 7th Respite Centre, that is probably an appropriate place, subject to the right answers being received from the National Defence and Community Safety departments in Ottawa, to have that 7th Respite site.
Was the city caught off guard? I mean, advocates have been warning for a very long time that we're facing a crisis. Do we have enough staff? Is that part of the problem of that miscommunication with the shelter person saying there's no room? And was the city woefully unprepared for this situation?
I think the answer to the question is no, we were not. We had a plan in place for the winter, but when you look at what actually transpired in terms of weather that is being described as unprecedented, I think the day a couple of days ago was the coldest day in 50 years. The refugee situation, which was something that obviously was coming to our attention as the year wore on, we took steps. But again, I think this is a very fluid, evolving situation, and I think the challenge that's in front of us is to adapt to that situation as circumstances change, whether it be the weather, whether it be the influx of people, some of whom are coming from other parts of the region, not just from Toronto. And so that's what we're doing. With respect to the communications, I want to just say this, and I say this without taking away for 1 minute from the praise that was heaped upon by all of us, the staff, the city staff. The communication miscommunication that took place, where people were told there was not space when in fact there was, is not defensible. And that is something we have to get to the bottom of, as to how that could happen, that somebody could phone one part of the city government and be told there was no space, when in fact there was space, and if they'd made a phone call to another part of the city government, that would have been confirmed. And that is why I welcome Mr. Raftus's leadership in coming to the, getting to the bottom of this, as well as the Ombudsman's inquiry. I think these will be most welcome in terms of identifying something that I suspect, when we boil it down, is going to come down to, as in so many other areas of city government, a complete lack of technology, a complete lack of modernization of how any kinds of records are kept on these kinds of things, to the point where people are again using clipboards and pens to keep track of things, and you're going to get, I think, miscommunication of information. But the fact is that no one should have been told at any time, because it just wasn't true, that there wasn't space available for them. And that was confirmed to me by the staff at Peter Street last night, who told me, had they got the calls from anybody, that there would have always been a space found. They always find a space, and there has been a space throughout the period that we're talking about for anybody who looked for one.
So what has been done for tonight to ensure that that doesn't happen?
The city got caught off guard. When housing prices have been going up steadily for a while, the immigrant situation's coming in over the last couple of years, and you know, every winter it's cold, every winter someone dies on the street. How can you possibly be caught off guard?
I think Austin, Ana Bailão addressed that very well in her remarks, because we're not dealing here with something that is where you respond to it at the drop of a hat. We can come here forward with things that expand our emergency shelter offering to people, which is what we're doing today. But in the end, the answers that really are needed, and it goes, if the refugees started coming a year and a half or 2 years ago, the fact is that that is a long-term integration process that has to continue and be stepped up. With respect to things like mental health, putting that supportive housing in place is not something that can happen overnight, and there have been some small steps forward, positive steps taken by the provincial government, but there is much more that needs to be done. And in terms of the ultimate issue of affordable housing, that too is something that, even when we put up our pieces of land, for example, and for the first time in a decade, actually meet and exceed the targets for approval set by the City Council 5 or 6 years ago. For the first time now, we have a national housing strategy from the Government of Canada. But the implementation of those new measures and that new resolve to address all of these issues, supportive housing for mental health, refugee integration, national housing strategy, is going to take time. And I'm sorry it's going to, but the reality is we are now, I believe, addressing these issues, and we need to do more on mental health, but before they just weren't being addressed. The city's housing targets weren't being met, supportive housing was not being funded, and so the result you have is this huge number of people who are seeking permanent residence, frankly. In many cases they're living for 1,000 days in an emergency shelter, which is meant to house people for a few days or a few weeks while they get permanent housing.
Question for Councillor Mihevc. Councillor Mihevc, how long, you've been, as you said, on community development and recreation most of your career, how long have you been hearing reports about people, not just in the last week, but ongoing, calling the referral center, calling 311, and being told that there were no beds available. How long have you been aware that this is an issue?
Well, frankly, we established about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that 90% would be our target. And we have not been able to meet that target for the last, well, frankly, since we established the target. I think, though, that what has changed now, we've been hovering sometimes around 95%, 96, 94%, and sometimes 100% in certain areas. And many of us have been drawing attention to that, yourself included. I think what's changed now is that the sheer volume of people has pushed this really over the edge. Whereas before we had something like 4,200 beds, now we have a need for closer to 6,000 beds. That has pushed things really beyond the beyond. And I think that's the changed reality that we have now.
So let's talk about those numbers. On January 1st, by the census, which says 94 and 95%, there were 321 beds open, not 40 or 50. 321. Again, I ask you, have you known for a long time that as you go above 90%, that the likelihood is, even if your system shows hundreds of beds available, that people will call and be told no? Have you been aware of this as an ongoing issue?
Well, I honestly feel that our staff, and I think the agency staff, there are 52 agencies in the City of Toronto. There are 10 shelters that we run as a City of Toronto. And I think folks do their best to basically accommodate folks. Sometimes, well, I think it is an enormous coordination challenge to coordinate 52 agencies, 10 shelter facilities. The call for better technology, for better coordination, for more staff at the frankly the coordination and management level is absolutely essential to get the system getting right. And I think because it hasn't been right up to this point, yes, people have fallen through the cracks. Advocates have pointed that out. Councillors have been pointing that out. Staff have been pointing that out. So do we have a job in front of us? Absolutely. So let's seize the moment. Seize the political moment right now and try to get some of those things in place so that those kinds of mishaps, misinformation, lack of capacity are addressed as we push up the river to create more housing.
Do you have a breakdown? So when you cite a number to the public, this is how many beds were open. Do you, Mayor Tory's staff, shelter support and housing staff, can they break that down by shelter to prove they actually know that there are real beds in the world that are actually empty?
I think, Mr. Cole, the fact that I gave those numbers
Those were not
in
the
part.
numbers you provided.
I beg pardon?
The numbers that you provided.
Well, no, what I said here, for example, the Better Living Centre had 99 spaces filled last night out of 140.
Yes, but that's not the total system. That's
No, but I'm just saying that's one, and then I went through and said Cowan had space for 16, and I mentioned a number of others that were at capacity. So the answer to your question is yes.
Okay.
There's a report provided each day that talks about what the capacity was in each shelter, and we get that every day, as we did. I'm sure there's no reason why not. This is public information. Sure.
But are we not
Mayor-
well over capacity if you take into account the people that are sleeping on mats on the floors, the people that are in the Peters Street building that are sleeping on chairs in the lobby? Aren't we then well over capacity?
I will just say that in some cases, people end up in a place, whether it's at Peter Street, and I talked to some of them at Peter Street last night and said, well, you could go to the Better Living Centre and sleep in a better circumstance, not one that I would describe as ideal, but better. And they said, no, they wanted to stay there. I mean, again, part of the challenge that we face as a city, and I have been out, not this year, but last year I was out with the street outreach workers to actually listen to and engage in the conversation with some of the people that they reported having met last night on the street. And they say, thank you very much. They're very polite. They have a story to tell, which if you engage them, they will, but they don't want to go to some of these different kinds of places. I think the answer to your question is yes, there's an overall underhousing of a lot of people who are in far less than desirable circumstances. In fact, I would argue every single one of these people, of the 5,000, are in circumstances that are not what we would want for them. And that is why some of the things that Councillor Bailão mentioned, Deputy Mayor Bailão, are important, addressing mental health with supportive housing, addressing affordable housing generally. But What we're doing for the moment is making sure that people, in the face of the cold weather and other circumstances existent in the city, have a place to go, and that the information, even as importantly, is properly communicated so they know where to go and where to find the space, because the fact is there has not been a day yet, and we will keep moving to make sure there isn't a day where there isn't a space for someone who needs it.
Saturday, Sunday,
One at
Mayor
a time.
Tory.
Sorry, David. Yeah, go ahead.
Stepping away from the cold weather for a minute, on December 21st, we had a story about a woman who broke her leg, a homeless woman, and was able to find space on a yoga mat, but people tried for 4 days to find her a shelter spot and couldn't. Earlier, I believe in the summer, we had a Pierre Gregoire who was at a drop-in center, was fed, but was told there's no room for you tonight, and he ended up overdosing in a KFC bathroom. Activists who are on the front lines are saying, beyond the immediate crisis of cold and whether there was miscommunication, there's an overall crisis in the system where people who need help are not getting it. And they're questioning your commitment to it, especially since in the last budget, you led council to cut some frontline shelter staff. So do you have a commitment, and what exactly are you going to do?
Well, I would just say that the commitment that we will be giving to housing and shelter generally this year, and I think Councillor Bailão again went over this, will be at an unprecedented level. And we will continue to provide the support, as we've indicated, no hesitation in doing whatsoever. At the council meeting in December, there was no discussion of the budget that was involved in the expansion that the council approved at that time. You heard it said this morning that at no time did the question of budget or money ever come up during the discussions this past week about what we needed to do to make sure people were looked after. Now, where I will strenuously agree with you in the comments that you just made, and I think both of the examples you gave are examples where a temporary shelter system meant to provide people with emergency shelter in the event that they're homeless is not meeting the need of people with mental health issues or with complicated health issues of one kind or another. I met people last night, a man who'd had a stroke, and he's disabled, and he's in a scooter, and he is in one of our temporary shelters and shouldn't be there. He has complex needs, some of which are mental health related because he's had some issues with depression following his stroke. And we have nothing better to offer him in the absence of supportive housing. I talked to two people with addiction issues last night. The good news for both of them is they're going to programs in different fairly far-flung places of Ontario. But I think in a way it's interesting that they have to go that far away to get the treatment programs they need to help them get off drugs. And so one of the reasons I indicated today that I want to take up in earnest and with great determination the issue of, for example, mental health is because a huge portion, I would argue it might even be a majority of the people who are in our temporary shelters that we keep expanding and expanding are in fact people who need supportive housing, should not be in shelters, and they're not getting the support they need in the shelters, although we need to provide that obviously for them as a place to put their head down at night where it's warm and safe. But they're not getting the support they need.
Mayor Tory, I appreciate
Sorry,
that.
we're just going to go. Sorry, Travis, you had one, and we're going to go here, and then we'll come over to you. Okay?
Appreciate that you've outlined kind of.
No, I said we're going to go to this one.
We're going to go
first,
this one,
and then sorry.
All right.
You spoke with people that you met last night and that they are very polite and have stories and they'd rather not go to the Better Living Center. The people I'm speaking to say they don't want to go to the Better Living Center because it's far. Whether or not there are tokens to get them there, they're more comfortable in their surroundings, which is generally the east side, which is near Moss Park. And so my question is, why is it so complex to get these armories open, specifically Moss Park, if 4 times in the past they've been open in conditions that have not been as bad as what we're experiencing right now?
I think that anytime you're dealing with a different government, you're dealing with a military installation where they have to carry on with their functions there. You were dealing with some questions that have existed in the past when they've been used about their availability on a 24-hour basis, because it's one of the appeals to the Better Living Center is we don't have to ask people to leave at 7 o'clock in the morning. So I think that, as I've said, we have been posing those questions to the Government of Canada. They have to take into account answering those questions in a way that also takes account of the use of those buildings on an ongoing basis. I think that, as you've seen, they've generally indicated there's a degree of receptiveness to receiving these questions, and I've asked for some answers by the end of the day tomorrow, which I think is within their capacity. They've indicated that. And so when it comes to Moss Park, I've said if we get the right answers to those questions, we will move ahead to designate that in all likelihood as the 7th respite. It will certainly have my support, and we'll do that. But we opened the Better Living Center, and I will say that I did talk to the people last night, and they only told me what they told me, and not one of them raised the issue of having trouble getting there. They all said they were very grateful that it existed, that they had found their way there. They found their way there such that we've expanded it, and we will now try and do the same to create a 7th respite center in all likelihood in the eastern part of the city, probably or quite possibly at the Moss Park Armories.
Mayor Tory, I appreciate that you have talked about what the plans are in the months and the days to come. But for tonight, what is going to happen? Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, people were told that there is no room. People were turned away. What happens tonight to ensure that that communications issue does not happen again?
I think that message has been received. I was going to say, with the greatest respect, where people were told that, that was false information that they got, because there were spaces that people could have been referred to all of those nights without exception, including last night. And going forward,